That was good. I like that. So the theme for this year's chapel is telling God's story. And I was thinking of what to speak on, and this passage came to mind, the story of David. So I'm going to tell a little bit of part of David's story, which of course is part of Israel's story, which is part of the gospel story, and maybe part of that story too. That's kind of where I'm going with this. But last month I had a chance to run a half marathon. Anyone run marathons before? I know Lee's done lots, Paul. This was my first rodeo, as they say, my first half marathon. And I didn't really know what I was doing. I had always planned to do a lot of training before, but once semester started, I hardly got out running. But it turned out to be pretty good. But ahead of time, you had to pick which corral you're going to run in. So they corral you up like your cattle, I guess. But anyway, you have to think of how fast you're going to run the race. And so I signed up like in the summer or whenever it was. And so I just picked a slot, threw it in there. I didn't want to pick one that was too fast because I thought, well, I'll just be the slowest in the pack. And so I picked one that ended up being too slow, and I didn't know that. I didn't know that it really mattered. But when I got there, I was in like the blue corral or something like that. And they had all these porta potties there, and I'm getting nervous. Oh, I'll go use the porta potty before the race starts. And the race kind of started. But I came out, nobody was moving, and so it was fine. And I ended up, I didn't realize that I had drifted back into like the back corral. So I was even slower than I meant to. So I spent the whole race kind of trying to weave around people. But anyway. So I didn't know where I was supposed to be. And not only that, another thing that helps, I guess, is to kind of know where you're going, know what the track's like. Okay? I didn't know that it might be wise to kind of look up how the track goes or the road or where it goes. So I didn't even look that up ahead of time. Again, my first rodeo. But anyway, so partway through, I'm kind of like, I wonder where I am. They did have signs sometimes with K's on it or where you were, but I'd miss them all the time, trying to really concentrate like this. All the pictures they have of me, I'm going like this. But anyway, I wear this. I always bring my iPhone with me, which has this app that tracks your speed and distance and everything. And so, to make matters worse, I didn't really know where I was, but then my app told me that I finished. And then, actually, what it did is it said, only 1K left or whatever. And I'm like, oh, great. And so I pushed it as hard as I could. And then it said I finished. And then I was like, but I'm not finished. Clearly, I'm not finished. And so I didn't know the overlay of the whole route. And it was hard to keep pushing it after that because I gave it all for that kilometer that wasn't the last kilometer. But anyway, all that to say is, I guess it's helpful to know where to begin, where you're going, where you fit in the whole thing. And so my experience of the marathon kind of showed that I didn't know what I was doing. But anyway, in this story, I'm going to tell you a little bit of this story from 1 Samuel 25. And the context of this story is David is on the run from Saul. If you know the story of Saul, first king of Israel, tries to kill David, his would-be successor, or he suspects will be the successor. And in the story, he decides he's going to kill David, so David has to run away. So in the context, the previous story in chapter 24 was the Saul taking a leak in a cave. Hey, this is in the Bible. I'm not making this up. Okay. So David and his men are hiding in a cave. Saul shows up to use it as a bathroom, and they happen to be in the same cave. And so it's a kind of a famous story. Hopefully you've heard of it. So that's the previous story. And amazingly, David has a chance when Saul is caught with his pants down, literally, to take out his rival, to take out Saul. But he shows amazing restraint and doesn't do it. He could have, but he doesn't, out of respect for that God is going to put him on the throne, out of respect for he knows God's calling on his life, and that, hey, this guy is the Lord's anointed. So when we come to this chapter 25, we see David has a run-in with somebody else and isn't quite as restrained as he was in the previous story. So we see in this story, David is a mixed bag, as you could say. He's not an ideal character, not the character that I was taught about David when I was a kid in Sunday school. He's vengeful. He doesn't always make the right decisions. But you know what? I still like David. I know some people hate David, but for all his flaws. But David reminds me that God uses flawed people, and of course there is nobody but flawed people for God to use. But this story starts out in chapter 25, and it's an interesting context. It talks about the death of Samuel, the death of Samuel. Now, Samuel was the one who had anointed David to be king, right? And just like he had anointed Saul. And it says, Samuel dies. All Israel is mourning for him. And from this might have, I'm just speculating, given David's different reaction in this chapter from last chapter, that this could have affected David somewhat. After all, in the story, David has lost his wife. Saul took his wife away from him. His parents are now kind of in exile in Moab. If you read the story, he sends them out there to keep them safe. And now his spiritual mentor, Samuel, has died. Maybe he kind of thought Samuel would be there when he's crowned king, right? He was anointed, but now Samuel's dead. And maybe it stirs something in David where it isn't really working out the way he had hoped. But regardless of whether that's what's affecting him or not, he's on the run, and he ends up in the vicinity of a place called Maon. And this is a photograph of the guy he runs into. No, not really. But this guy in the story is funny. His name's Nabal, which in Hebrew means fool. So, fool. He runs into the fool here, okay? Well, sort of. I don't know if he ever really meets the fool. But he's in the vicinity of this landowner, very prominent man in the area. And his name is Fool. And David comes there at a time when they're shearing sheep. So sheep shearing time is a joyous occasion. There's always lots of festivities. There's lots of food on hand. They're ready to eat. And David and his men are hungry. He's on the run. Perfect time to ask a favor from the fool. And they're very polite. He sends 10 men to greet Nabal, fool. And it's some of the most polite greetings you ever have in the Bible. They use the word shalom 3 times. Like peace, peace, peace. Over. They're very polite, but it's kind of funny what they ask for. They say, remember all those times that your sheep were out there and your men were working in the wilderness? Nothing bad ever happened to them, right? You should give us some food. That's basically his argument. It's kind of like, you don't want something to happen to your business. That's kind of what's going on. So some have accused David of kind of racketeering or something with this, but scholars tell us that this was kind of common practice, and that legitimately Nabal owed David and his men for protection, for not hurting them. I don't know. Something like that. So in a way, it's legitimate in the ancient Near Eastern context, but in another way, it's David is kind of acting like all the other kings of the ancient Near East or something like that. When the people first asked for a king, Samuel warned them and said, well, look, if you get a king, this is what it's going to be like. He's going to take. He's going to take your sheep, take your all this stuff. So David is kind of starting to act a little bit like this king Samuel warned about, actually. But in the ancient Eastern context, Nabal should have realized it was a legitimate request. But the fool's response wasn't that great. So just think, if you're Nabal, you could have sent back some men with a little modest gift maybe and said, okay, thanks, here you go. Or maybe sent back and said, sorry, we can't spare anything, but thanks for your protection, or something. I don't know, I'm just speculating. But instead, Nabal decides to send people back and insult him and give him nothing. So totally insults David. Calls him son of Jesse in a pejorative way, like Saul does. So Fool seems like he was a Saul supporter. He comes from the area of Carmel. Carmel was the place we find earlier in the story that Saul erected an altar or a monument to himself. So, and he's calling him son of Jesse just like Saul does. He's probably a Saul supporter. And he also says in verse 25, he says, there's lots of servants breaking away from their masters these days. Who's this David? So he kind of thinks that David is just rebelling against Saul. So David gets a little ticked off. Would you ever get ticked off? Someone kind of wrongs you? Anyone here ever been wronged? Yeah, hallelujah. Yeah, I see that hand, brother. Okay. So, when that happens, what's your first response? Well, Nabal has acted like a fool. He lives up to his name. David, though, has a chance to show what kind of person he is in his reaction. Now, in case you think that it's a matter of life or death, it's kind of funny when David actually leaves 200 men behind to watch the supplies that they have. So some have argued that, David and his men, it's life and death, they need this food. It doesn't appear to be that way. But David actually instructs his men, get on your sword. we're going to go and there's not going to be anyone left alive. That's pretty harsh, especially when we consider the previous chapter, he shows such restraint with Saul. Now this one guy insults him, and I'm going to go clean house. I'm going to kill all of the males, he says, not just Nabal. Now, I think David is starting to forget where he is in God's story. So, story, God, I think that's the theme, right? In the previous chapter, when he didn't kill Saul, he'd said stuff like, I know God is going to avenge me. And Saul's like, I know your kingdom is going to be established. God is working on your behalf. He kind of remembered how he fit into the plan. In this story, I think David's kind of getting a little amnesia and kind of forgetting what's going on here. So David's response to Nabal is not very charitable, you could say. And I think it's showing that he's forgetting where he's been, kind of like I forgot or never knew on the marathon where I was going. But David is starting to write his own story here, you could say, maybe, apart from God's plan. Now, his experiences have turned out different than he planned. He gets anointed king. He has this grand victory over the giant. All these things are going so well for him. And then now he's on the run. He's lost his family. His mentors died. His experiences haven't lived up to his expectations. I think that's a lot of what's going on here. Might be a little jaded. Might be doubting where he fits in God's story. This reminded me of The Lord of the Rings. One of my favorite parts of the Two Towers, the book The Two Towers, is a conversation Frodo and Sam have, which gets brought up quite a bit, where they talk about being in tales and what happens with tales. I think I got a bit of it here. He says, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into. I wonder, said Frodo. But I don't know. That's the way of a real tale. He says, you may know or guess what kind of tale it is. Happy ending or sad ending. The people in it don't know. You don't want them to. And so David, I think, is he's in the middle of a tale. He's not really sure where it's going. I can relate to my life. I don't always know where I'm going, not only when I'm running. But things don't go as you expect. And I think that's what David is finding here. But rather than this meaning that we're actually not part of God's story, I think we just have to realize how little of the story we know ahead sometimes, exactly how it's happening. But that's what happens with good stories. So David, thankfully, meets Abigail. Now, Abigail is Nabal's wife. It's interesting when they're introduced at the beginning. Nabal is called fool, and it's not only his name, but he says he's surly and he's mean in all his dealings. But then his wife is beautiful and intelligent, and she lives up to that. She shows herself to be very wise. So Abigail hears of David, of her husband's response to David. And just as she comes to approach David, we hear about David's plan. He said, strap on your sword. And he says, hey, you can check your translation if this is accurate. He says, we're going to kill everyone who pisses against the wall. It's in the King James. I'm just reading the King James. Okay. When I was a kid, I loved that translation because I wasn't allowed to use that word at home. But we were a King James only family when I was a kid, so it worked out great. But anyway, but it's interesting here. It's often translated in most modern translations just all the males, because they have that God-given ability to do that thing. But anyway, there may be an intertext here with the previous chapter when there was a guy doing that against the wall. This is how I understand this, that Nabal here is kind of like Saul. So not only is he going to go kill all those who are peeing on the wall, can I say that? Like Saul was, but there's several other allusions to Saul here in this story. A little later, when Abigail goes back and talks to Nabal, it says he's having a banquet like a king, kind of like King Saul. Could have been a connection there with that. And not only that, David says he's going to kill him because he's paid me back evil for good. Well, in the previous chapter, that's exactly what Saul said. He said, I've paid you evil for good. So it's kind of like Nabal is standing in for Saul here. So maybe we can figure out why David is reacting so strongly. He really did want to take out Saul, but he didn't out of respect for the anointing and for God's plan. But now someone else is doing it, that's it. I'm taking out all my anger on Saul, on him, and all his house. So this could be an allusion to that bathroom episode, the wording there. So David had been super restrained, and now he's completely unhinged, you could say. Going to go wipe out all the males for being insulted here. Well, Abigail, providentially, you could say, shows up. And she helps him gain perspective. And what I want to focus on for this sermon, thinking of how we are in God's story, is how Abigail kind of talks David out of it. What she does is, I think, help him regain perspective that he's part of God's story. So, helps him regain his perspective and says, hey, David, God is working through you. She shows great humility and respect, unlike Nabal's men, he said, who insulted him. She kind of bows, does all this stuff, calls her husband a fool, makes a pun on his name. He lives up to his name, she says. But her key move here is that she gives her version of God's story. She reminds David, he says, that God has kept you from bloodshed, from avenging with your own hands. Maybe she knows a little bit of that story, what happened in the previous chapter where he didn't move against Saul. There were a lot of people there, and David came out of the cave, talked to people from all Israel about it. She also locates his struggles, saying that, David, you're fighting the Lord's battles. I think that's interesting. You're fighting the Lord's battles. It's not just about you, David. You are part of God's story. You are fighting the battles of Yahweh, the Lord's battles. And she also says in verse 28, the Lord is going to make a lasting dynasty for you. These are all things that David should remember, that he's part of God's plan. She also reminds him how the story's going to end. In verse 30, she says, when the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him, and appointed him leader over Israel. So she helps him regain perspective that God is actually working through you. He's going to make you leader of Israel. And you are fighting God's battles. Back to that conversation between the hobbits. I got a kind of a longer quote here that I'll read part of, and the tail end is up there. When they're talking about how they don't really know where you are in a tale, they start talking about a tale they were told as little hobbits. They're littler hobbits. I don't know, halflings, whatever you call them. He said, of course not. A guy named Baron, I don't know this tale, he says he never thought he was going to get that Silmarin from the Iron Crown in Thorogrindim. Hey, you know that one, right? He says, and yet he did, and he was in a worse and blacker place than we are right now. But that's a long tale, of course, he says. And it goes on past the happiness and grief and beyond it. And then they went to Arendelle, and then he suddenly, the light clicks. He goes, hey, I never thought of that before. You've got the light of Arendelle with you right now that the lady gave you. So what he's doing is he's telling this old tale he knew as a kid, and then he suddenly remembers. He says, hey, come to think of it, we're in the same tale still. We're in the same tale. It's going on. Don't the great tales ever end? So all that to say is, all of a sudden he realizes he's part of this grand story that's been going on for a long time. They're part of the same tale. And so I kind of think of that in terms of salvation history, God's story, the gospel. We're part of that same tale. Sam suddenly realized they were part of the same tale he heard as a kid. And with the speech of Abigail, I think that David is beginning to realize, of course, he's part of something bigger. He's fighting the Lord's battles. He regains his perspective and he submits to God's story. And as Christians, that's what we need to do too. We need to have that perspective. I'm not sure what's going on in your life right now, but I often need to be woken up and reminded that it's bigger than me, that I'm part of a bigger tale. I'm part of God's story. Back to Nabal. So Abigail goes back. David agrees not to kill him, and very gracious of him. But Abigail goes back to talk to her husband Nabal, and he's having a drunken banquet at the time. And a feast fit for a king. That might be an allusion again to Saul. She decides, I'm not sure if it's merciful or mean, she decides to wait until the next morning to tell him when he's hungover. Sober. I'm not sure. What is that, mean or merciful? I don't know. But literally, actually, what it says, when the wine was going out of him. Is this another bathroom humor allusion? It could be. But anyway. But that's what it says. Could be another bathroom scene. When she tells him, sorry, this might be a graphic image, you don't have to look, but Nabal's heart turns to stone, it says, and it failed him. What exactly happens is unclear. Might have had a heart attack, been in some kind of coma, some stroke, people speculate. But clearly the narrator says Yahweh struck him in 25:38. So David didn't have to worry about doing this. He was part of God's plan, and God was moving on his behalf. Then he goes back and he marries Abigail. That might have come out of nowhere if you're reading the story up to that moment. Oh, well, he's marrying her. And there's a lot more we could say about David and all of his wives, etc. But on hearing the news that Nabal died, Abigail joins David, and most scholars think that this was a key moment for him gaining influence in the area too, because he was a prominent man and probably came to have influence through Abigail over that area. There's a lot been written on that. But remembering God's story, David ends up remembering that his future he's part of the story. God is raising him up. God is using him. Abigail reminds him, God is going to make you leader of Israel. Kind of remember his principles. Trusting God with our future is remembering God's story. Back to them again. One more quote from the Hobbitses, as some would say. He says, "Still, I wonder if we'll ever be put into songs or tales. We're in one, of course. But I mean, put into words, by the fireside or read in a great big book with red and black letters years and years afterwards. Will ever be in one of the great tales?" Well, I think it's important to remember we're part of the greatest story ever told in the gospel. In God's, we are part of the church. We are Christ's body. And we are part of a bigger story. And I think that can be very encouraging no matter where you're at today. And what you might be struggling with. We don't always see where we are exactly in the tale, but we know the end of the tale. We know how the book ends. We know who God is and what his bigger plan is. So knowing connects us, I think, in a way that we need. It links us and bonds us to something greater than where we are normally. Knowing is kind of like, instead of being on an isolated little pond by yourself, we're part of this grand river of God's story that's flowing, and you're part of it. And I find that very encouraging. So David here in this story learns not to seek revenge, seize power with his own hand, at least at this point in his life, but to depend on God and God's timing. And David wasn't the only one to patiently wait for God to fulfill his word. Later, you could say maybe at the climax of the story, another anointed one, a son of David, Jesus, when they hurled insults at him, didn't retaliate. When he suffered, made no threats, but entrusted him to judges justly. So in that way, this story looks forward to Christ. And we are called to follow in his steps, it says in 1 Peter 2. So in the words of Samwise Gamgee, why to think of it, we're in the same tale. It's still going on, and we're part of it. We're part of God's continuing story. I'm just going to close in prayer. God, thanks for the grand narrative, the story of salvation that we can be part of, God. It's humbling that we can be part of the same ongoing story you're telling, and that you can use flawed individuals like David and us. And God, we pray, God, that we would always remember and look to you and your word and your story as we struggle and try and serve and make sense of life. Pray in Jesus' name, amen.